In this video module, we're going to explore the two different creation stories found in Genesis and the various listings of the quote-unquote 10 Commandments that can be found in the Tanakh, and some of the controversies that have arisen due to, let's say, discrepancies, etc. Okay, well, first, the two different creation accounts. In my many years of teaching religions courses, I'm often surprised to learn that most of my students, virtually all of them in fact, are not aware of the existence of two different creation stories in Genesis. Although if you actually read the Bible, and I think that might be the problem, sorry about that, and you start at Genesis chapter 1, you get the narrative about the night turning into day, and the morning came and it was good, and so forth and so on. I think that version of Genesis many of us are somewhat familiar with. And then everything finishes, God rests on the seventh day, etc. And then all of a sudden, in chapter 2, verse 5, a totally different version begins. The wording is different, the emphasis is different, the name of God is different. The story is a more sort of elaborate telling of the creation event. And in fact, it's quite different in many different ways. And one can't overlook the fact that all of a sudden, he or she is reading yet another account of creation. So what are some of these differences that we find in the two accounts? And by the way, if you have a Bible, you can certainly check this stuff yourself. The first thing that's pretty obvious is that the order of creation is different in both stories. And again, you can do this yourself with pencil and a piece of paper. In the first Genesis account, the order of creation is the sky, then the earth, then the plants, and then the great lights of the day and the night, the sun and the moon. Interestingly enough, by the way, which were created the day after plants and fruit-bearing trees were created, which of course is a problem in and of itself. And then after the great lights of the day and the night, we get aquatic animals and birds. And then finally, lastly, we get animals, then followed by male and female created together. When we move to Genesis 2, the order is earth and heaven first, then water, then male, man as a male, then plants, then animals and birds, and lastly, female. So as I said, the order of creation of things is quite different. What about some other dissimilarities? Well, the writer of Genesis 1 refers to God as Elohim, and the writer of the second chapter Genesis version refers to God as Yahweh. The first account sort of reads like a hymn. It has a fairly definite sort of structure, the kind of thing you would find maybe like in the Vedas of Hinduism. Whereas the second Genesis account reads kind of like almost like a bedtime story. In the first Genesis account, God is totally transcendent. In other words, God is a totally other being who is bringing creation forth. Whereas in the second Genesis account, God is immanent. In fact, at one point it says, the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So God is immanent in the second Genesis account. Also, too, as I mentioned earlier, in the first Genesis account, males and females are created together. In fact, the passage is, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created him. Whereas in the second Genesis account, of course, the male, is created, and much later, after plants, animals, and birds, we get the female being created. in the first Genesis account, it's implied that humans are to subdue the earth, control it. They're given dominion over it. Whereas in the second Genesis account, it's sort of implied that humans should serve the earth. We should be its caretakers. So slightly different emphasis. Given the different tone, the different words for God, and various other clues, scholars place the writing of Genesis 1 at some time around the exile. And that would, of course, be the priestly writers that we've talked about. And the Genesis account that begins in chapter 2 has been dated way back to the J writer, sometime around 1100 BCE, 1000 BCE, roughly about the time of David. So it's thought that they're written about 500 years apart, actually. In regard to the commandments, we have another interesting situation with 3 sets of commandments that have been mentioned most prominently. One found in Exodus 20, another found in Exodus 34, and then finally a third version found in Deuteronomy 5. Now I'm just going to say enough to kind of pique your interest, and hopefully you'll follow up on these things, since clearly, since we're talking 10 Commandments here, that has some bearing, I would guess, on the religion that most of my students follow and practice. First of all, let me just state something that I hope is sort of obvious. The 10 Commandments are part of the Tanakh, and so they're not literally Christian per se. Now, Christians clearly have appropriated the Tanakh and the Hebrew Scriptures to some extent, but the 10 Commandments are properly Jewish from the Hebrew Scriptures. Just wanted to make that point. The problem comes in because the list of commandments found in Exodus 20 and then again in Exodus 34 are quite a bit different. In fact, 3 of them do agree, but other than that, they're quite a bit different. Exodus 20, this is the first place where the commandments were mentioned, where Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and retrieves the first copy. And at that point, it is dictated to us what's on that copy, and that's generally what we see posted as the 10 Commandments. But what's puzzling to many is that when you reach Exodus 34, now please let me note, I need to point out here that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai having an audience with Yahweh, the Israelites had reverted to idolatry. And so Moses, in his anger, upon returning down the mountain, threw down the tablets and they were destroyed. That was mentioned in one of the other modules. And okay, so keep that in mind. Now, when we get to Exodus 34, and you can read this yourself, here's what we find. Exodus 34, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, cut 2 stone tablets like the first, and I will write on the tablets the words which were on the first tablets, which you broke in pieces. And then as we go through verses, let's see, 34:17 through 26, we get various commandments that I'll read to in a minute. And then it picks up right at 27 and says, the Lord said to Moses, write these words down, because the covenant I make with you and with Israel is in these words. So Moses stayed there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, neither eating nor drinking, and wrote down the words of the covenant, the 10 words. In other words, it states explicitly in verse 28, 10 words. In other words, the 10 commandments, the Decalogue. And so these 2 passages where Moses is told to cut stone tablets, and I will write on the tablets the words which were on the first tablets, and then the use of the words 10 words, or the 10 commandments, these 2 passages sandwich a rather odd collection of commandments. And I'll read through them for you quickly, and you will see why people are somewhat puzzled by this. And these are paraphrased versions. The first commandment, thou shalt worship no other God. Second one, thou shalt make thee no molten gods. That's similar to graven images. Number 3 is where it starts to get a little strange. The feast of unleavened bread shalt thou keep in the month when the ear is on the corn. Number 4, all the firstborn are mine. Number 5, 6 days shalt thou work, but on the 7th thou shalt rest. Well, that's keep the Sabbath day holy. In fact, remember I said that there were actually 3 that do coincide when we compare the first version with this one. Number 6, thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks. Number 7, thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread. Number 8, the fat of my feast shall not remain all night until the morning. Number 9, the first of the first fruits of thy ground thou shalt bring unto the house of the Lord thy God. And number 10, thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Well, I know that sounds a little strange, but I'm reading them right out of the biblical text. And of course now, there is a great difference of opinion on this issue. For the skeptic, of course, they're going to jump all over this and say, what the heck's going on here? We're clearly told that this is the version that was on the first. They're called the 10 Commandments. How much more clear can they be? But yet apologists will argue that in fact what we have just read is a set of ritual commandments that were part of the covenant that the Israelites were to keep with Yahweh, whereas the first set of commandments were the ethical commandments. And there are some other subtle issues there too that are brought up by those who attempt to rescue this apparent discrepancy. And so I'm just going to leave it at that, and I will let you take a few seconds, compare the versions in Exodus 20 and Exodus 34, and of course there's lots of material online that you can pursue, but they do differ, and it is interesting, and I'll just leave it to you to come to your own interpretation there. I should also mention that in regard to the 10 Commandments, we do have 3 versions as far as, let's say, religious versions now. We're not talking about biblical versions now, we're talking about religious versions that are popular. There's a Protestant version, there's a Catholic version, there's a Jewish version. And actually, they don't necessarily coincide. Like, for example, the second commandment, according to Protestants and Jews, basically states that we shall not make unto thee any graven image, etc., or thou shalt have no other gods before me. So pretty much the same, Jewish and Protestant. However, the Catholic version, number 2, reads, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Commandment number 3 for Jews and Protestants has to do with taking the Lord of thy God in vain, yet commandment number 3 for Catholics is remember to keep the Sabbath day holy. And there are other discrepancies as we go through these. So which one is actually posted publicly when we see them posted? Well, that generally is the Protestant version. Of course, remember in the United States, Christianity is primarily Protestant Christianity, and it's usually the Protestant version that gets posted. And of course, in regard to that issue, please refer to the First Amendment where you see the Establishment Clause. If you want to understand why is it that the 10 Commandments cannot be posted on public property, any property that basically is supported by taxpayer funds. That's the so-called separation of church and state issue, and something that you should definitely look into.